Welcome back, Achan Ricardo, and you guys to my presentation on the course of Introduction to International Relations. I hope this presentation will bring you more information as well as something to think of Sri Lanka's economic and political crisis. One of the most discussed countries in 2022 is Sri Lanka, which has announced the bankruptcy situation in this April. And this is the content that I will talk about the country in this presentation. So before we getting into any further discussion, I'm showing some facts here about Sri Lanka so we can get the foundational understanding about the country. And as of now, the president of Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka is Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe. So let's begin. Okay, let's start with the background of the problem. So the chaos in Sri Lanka caused by the government's economic mismanagement, it has weakened Sri Lanka's public finances, and the situation was magnified because of the significant tax cuts enacted by the Rajapaksa government shortly after it took the office in 2019. And in 2021, the president banned the chemical fertilizer imports, decimating the rice crops and increasing prices. Sri Lanka's debt-laden economy has collapsed and it cannot afford for food, fuel, and medicines. The president, Wickremesinghe, said that the economy was headed to the rock bottom as the government owes 51 billion US dollars and cannot pay the interest. The country's currency collapsed by 80%, increasing import prices and inflation. And in the emergency situation, Sri Lanka had 25 million US dollars in the usable foreign reserves and needs 6 billion US dollars to last for 6 months. So what are the significances of Sri Lanka's worst crisis? The collapse of Sri Lanka highlights the importance of transparency and the public engagement in how the governments raise, spend, and manage the taxpayer money, including when the countries take on new debt. Because according to the IMF, debt transparency reduces default risk. Sri Lanka's financial turmoil could be contagious. Even the countries like Russia and Brazil were affected by the Asian financial crisis in 1997. So whether or not Sri Lanka's default will be an isolated incident or the first of many crises to hit developing countries, we don't know about that, but it has naturally stimulated the interest of investors and analysts. And also, the protests in Sri Lanka were historically significant because they led to the removal of a despised leader and could be an indicator for the future change. The key historical movements have brought together diverse groups in a show of peaceful pushback despite troubling trend of democratic backsliding sweeping across the country. Okay, to continue, we are now on the state level of analysis. So Sri Lanka has experienced severe shortages of essential items such as fuel and medicines, like I mentioned before, and struggles to import goods due to decreasing the foreign exchange reserves and rising debt. The nation has suffered from high inflation, it's fallen into a fixed debt trap, and as a result, the interest payment on the sovereign debt and import prices has been dramatically increasing. Seeking for the international support, Sri Lanka's officials, led by Finance Minister Mr. Ali Sabri, traveled to Washington, D.C. for discussion with the IMF as the South Asian country faces its worst economic crisis in over 7 decades. And regarding the international support, the World Bank, the IMF, India, and China have participated in financial aiding and rescuing Sri Lanka from the swamp of crisis with billions of US dollars. Next will be the system level of analysis. So the world has undergone many unfavorable events, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, the invasion of Russia and Ukraine, and the supply chain crisis, which had caused the soaring inflation, spiking prices of energies, foods, and the national debt crisis in other countries as well. So these global events contributed and escalated the Sri Lanka's crisis. And it's possible that Sri Lanka's economic crisis would spread globally. The political and economic disturbance of the countries is a warning sign of potential trouble for other emerging markets, and it's not just a domestic problem. The financial crisis in Sri Lanka has affected its trade with India, negatively impacted on the Chinese investment ties. Investors from China have massive infrastructure investments in Sri Lanka, and they have experienced significant losses due to the country's chaos. So what is happening in the world right now affects Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka's crisis unintentionally contributed to the world's crisis. It goes like a cycle, right? And it's not only Sri Lanka, but any countries now are in trouble will also affect the rest of the world. So at the individual level of analysis, the former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa is Sri Lanka's nightmare. He has a strong political background before being elected for Sri Lanka president in 2019. However, since then, he has been accused of war crimes and human rights violations, but has remained one step ahead of the law. Assumably, his background in politics brought him to the highest position as a president, right? And by which he destroyed Sri Lanka's economy with his zero economic experience. In other words, Rajapaksa doesn't know how to deal with the financial issues, but made them more seriously. So these are the 5 key terms that I selected from the topic: the citizen mobilization, the open budget survey, the debt judges, and the ethno-majoritarianism, and the democratic backsliding. The citizen mobilization, so whether on a local, national, or the international scale, the citizen mobilization refers to a concerted effort to shape the political and policy processes. So you link this one with Sri Lanka, right? The country has some of the citizen mobilization during the crisis. So because of that, the Rajapaksa president, he left the country. So it started in 2006. The Open Budget Survey is the only international fact-based and comparative research tool that measures and compares budget transparency and the public participation. Imagine if in Sri Lanka we have this thing, right? Might be the situation could not have been this worse. Okay, the next one, the debt justice. The debt justice was founded in 1986 in the UK, so it fights for the unfair debt and its global poverty and inequality. So the debt justice organization also was not in Sri Lanka. Even now, they don't have it in Sri Lanka. But if they exist in Sri Lanka, I think they might have some different for the country. And next one, the ethno-majoritarianism. It could be generated from the ethnic majoritarianism. So this one is the view that a decision should be made based on the preferences of the largest group of people in the country. So I think this one, if we associate it with Sri Lanka, right, the country has been leading by a largest group of ethnic. Yeah, so this is the thing that happening in Sri Lanka. The last one is democratic backsliding. So democratic backslide occurs when the state systematically dismantles and undermines democratic institutions. Sri Lanka calls itself a democratic country, right? But I think it's just a title. The country has no democracy at all. That is from my view. So okay, so these are the 5 key terms that I have for you guys. Okay, so now we are at the conclusion, and I would like to conclude that despite the challenges and unknowns, the people of Sri Lanka have a chance to rebuild and create their new future for the country, and they should not expect instant results. And not only at the national level, but the financial collapse and crisis in Sri Lanka is also a cautionary tale about the perils of emerging markets, which are the most of the world. And there will be challenges for the country in the future, of course. But what Sri Lanka needs right now is to change, to develop. This is the mission for the new president, Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe, who needs to reform his country politically and economically. The lesson of having transparency and the clarity in budget management is crucial for the Sri Lankan governments and other countries as well to learn and to take it seriously to avoid being on the brink of the catastrophe. On top of that is helping Sri Lankan citizens back on their feet is a must because they have been suffering tremendously from the crisis, and Sri Lankan people are one of the key factors to help Sri Lanka to recover. Okay, so the conclusion about Sri Lanka crisis is the end of this presentation, and by which I hope that there will be some useful takeaways or information for you guys. And thank you very much, Ajahn Ricardo, for once again having me in your class. You know, learning about international relations and developments are one of the wonderful things that I have done at Stanford. Especially, the courses are taught by a passionate and professional educator like you, Ajahn Ricardo. If you have any further questions, please feel free to contact me at my email or LinkedIn account or reach me at the phone number as given here. Once again, thank you very much. Goodbye and all the best.